Good morning. Welcome to the 11 o'clock Eastern session on Easy Money, American Puritans, and the Invention of Modern Currency. We have Dror Goldberg is joining us from Tel Aviv. Dror is a senior faculty member in the Department of Management and Economics at the Open University of Israel, where he teaches economic history and monetary economics. And Dror is the author of the recently published Easy Money by University of Chicago. I'm really looking forward to this presentation. It's kind of amazing to me that we would have an international scholar looking at our earliest American paper money. That's something that probably would not have happened before the age of the internet. So looking forward to hearing Dror's perspective on early American paper money. So Dror, with that, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. I should note that Israel is currently a war zone. You probably know that. And there is a small probability that there will be a rocket siren at any moment. If that happens, I will have to relocate to the safe room that every apartment has here. And I will, about a minute or two later, I will continue talking to you from there. So that's possible. I hope it won't happen, but it's possible. So I'm a complete outsider. I'm a foreigner. I'm not a collector, not a numismatist. I'm an economist. But actually, I'm very excited to be here because my first relation with money was as a collector. When I was a teenager in Israel, I was a very amateur collector. And it was a very, very exciting time to be a collector in Israel because we kept having new higher denominations of currency all the time. There was a very high inflation, 450% in the 1980s. So the denominations kept growing and new paper money, new coins all the time, very, very exciting. So I became a collector about that time. Then I was drafted to the military and I never picked it up again. But I did become an economist, and this inflationary episode motivated me to specialize in monetary economics. And when I studied in the US, at the University of Rochester, one of the professors said, well, we don't even really know why people accept paper money anymore because it's no longer backed by gold. So why is that? So I came across a theory that it's because we have to pay taxes with it. Meaning that if we choose not to use in the US dollar bills or bank accounts that are fed by dollar bills, then we will have a problem on tax day because the IRS accepts only dollar bills or more commonly dollar denominated bank accounts, bank transfers. So that's an old theory. It appears in Adam Smith. And it turns out that he did not write about it as a theory, but as practice. He wrote about the American colonies, which became states at the moment that he was publishing his book. And he wrote, well, that's what they do there in America and only there. And that's a new thing. He didn't really like it, but he realized that it would work. That for getting paper money to circulate, you don't need gold, actually. So I started reading about American paper money, and everybody pointed to 1690 Massachusetts. That's not a secret. Every collector of American paper money knows about 1690 Massachusetts. Every colonial historian who is even remotely interested in the economy of the colonies knows about it. That this was the first. To me, as a foreigner, the fact that it was the first paper money in America didn't mean much. As a foreigner who experienced very high inflation, to me it meant something different. That was the origin of modern currency. And 17 years later, that's what I have on the title of the book. So the Puritans invented our currency. So after many years of studying American history from scratch, I came up with this book. It was published half a year ago. So that's the title of the book. And the paper money looks like this. I will show you more pictures at the end. but that's the best we have of the very first issue of this paper money, December 10th, 1690. That's the date on this bill. It's called the bill. It's not even called money. I will tell you later why. It's in the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem. And that's the first modern money. So I will try to tell you why it was invented in Massachusetts. It's not as trivial as you might seem. Maybe it's obvious to you that it's not trivial, but I will try to make the puzzle even more puzzling, and then I will try to solve it. So that's what the book is about. And I argue that this is a monetary revolution. And why is that? Because until that point in time, every currency was backed in some way by intrinsically useful commodities. So the classic example is a gold coin. It's gold. You could have a banknote backed by gold, or there was an alternative. We learned about it from the first time from Marco Polo. He says the Mongol emperor of China prints paper money. He's not backing it with gold that he has. He's backing it with the goods that people sell in the private economy. In what way? He forces all the sellers to accept it. So instead of holding gold and converting paper money for that gold upon demand, he told all the sellers, that's what Marco Polo tells us, he told all sellers, you have to accept this paper money for your commodities. If you don't, we kill you. So that's an alternative way of backing paper money with intrinsically useful commodities. And Massachusetts in 1690 was the first time we know of in human history when that was set aside, and the only method of backing the currency or helping it to circulate was just its acceptance by the state itself as legal tender for taxes. So we have to ask why in Massachusetts, a small colony on the fringe of Western civilization, and why in 1690? What was interesting in 1690? So I bet most of you know about the Salem witch trials. You wouldn't expect a monetary revolution to come out of the fools who committed this atrocity of 1692 Salem witch trials. So I will try to explain why it happened there and then. It's critical to understand the historical context. We're not talking about a normal economy using gold and silver coins and then one day deciding to use paper money instead. The context is a very long list of currencies throughout the 17th centuries, very strange colonial currencies, and I have some examples here: tobacco, maize, fur, wampum, sugar, and more. That was the context. So this invention did not come out of the blue. It came after decades of monetary creativity. I think that's critical to explain the invention that was the first in history. So that's what the book is about. And I will talk about, first of all, kind of to set things straight, what do I mean by modern currency legally? Then I will expand about the money in the colonies before 1690. I'll talk a lot about Massachusetts at that particular moment. Then I will ask, why did they invent a new money and how were they able to do it? So the question why, they had some necessity, and we know that necessity is the mother of invention. But many, many states or colonies in the early modern period had this necessity of inventing a new type of money because of a military crisis, military financial crisis. Most of them failed, but Massachusetts succeeded. And here I will talk about the Puritans' unique ability among all the societies in America and in the European American world at that point in time. I will end with something that is close to what you call in numismatics census. It's not exactly a census, but I will talk about and show you some pictures, sort of all the bills that I know. I needed it for the research, actually. So I guess that would be of interest, at least to some of you. So I'll talk about that in the end. So legally speaking, what is modern currency? Well, it's written on the paper money. I think only in the US, it's written very explicitly. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. I won't take you through the legislative history of this and the law, which is actually the one that is important, the federal law, but the public debts, it refers both to debts of the public to people and also to taxes, debts that the public owes to the government. Taxpayers owe to the government, so it applies to both. And that's what you have on paper money today. It doesn't say gold. It used to say gold, but that actually ended in 1933, as you surely know. FDR confiscated all the gold coins and other gold from the economy, and since then you don't have gold coins circulating anymore. And after World War II, the relation between paper money and gold remained in a very tenuous way. Only in the United States, there was a promise to hold a certain amount of gold in Fort Knox for every dollar being printed. There was also an international guarantee that other central banks could convert their dollar bills into gold held by the US. And that was the only relation, the only connection that currencies all over the world had to gold. It all went through the US, and this guy ended it. In 1971, that's the exact moment in which he says, we are temporarily suspending the convertibility of dollars into gold. So today, all we have is legal tender. There's legal tender for taxes. There's also legal tender for private debts, like private contractual debts, and it can be damages that the court rules, could be alimony, could be fines. But I think taxes are the most important point, because most of you are Americans, you know that nothing is certain in life other than debts and taxes. So taxes are really unavoidable. And if the government says you have to pay them in our currency rather than, let's say, Bitcoin, that's a big incentive to get this currency. And the most reasonable currency is to sell your goods for it or to accept wages in it. So in 1971, we actually went back 3 centuries to this paper money from December 1690. So how did it all happen? So I'll talk about the money in the colonies before 1690, and I will start with the coat of arms of New York City. So maybe you noticed it, that you had the 2 beavers here in this coat of arms, and that's because New York, as a Dutch colony, New Netherlands, it was founded for beaver furs. So we have here an old map. The north is on the right side. And I hope you can see here Manhattan's, that's here. And here you have Fort Orange, which is Albany. You have a tasty turkey here, but the main action is these 4 badly painted beavers. So the Native Americans hunted beavers and they sold them to the Dutch colonists and later the English colonists. And the colonists sent it all to Europe to make hats. That's it. So New York was founded for hats. And that was also the initial economic foundation for Plymouth and also for Canada. So that entire very important area was built on hats, pretty much. So the beaver fur in this processed form that was shipped to Europe, it was called a pelt. And that's how it looked like. Looks like a coin by coincidence. So that was the currency in Canada first. Later it was adopted in some colonies, not all of them. In some northern colonies, it was adopted as official currency. Now, something similar happened in the other colonies as well. So if in the northern colonies, the main product was beaver pelts, in Virginia, the first colony, they had it with tobacco. They grew tobacco. They exported it to Europe, and they exported all the tobacco, obviously, to get European manufacturers, but they also paid for manufacturers with all the coins they had to those European ships. So they ended up not having enough coins. So what did they do? They adopted tobacco as official currency. And already in 1624, you have even the official budget of Virginia listed in pounds of tobacco. Maryland did the same. Plymouth started with beaver pelts, but then it switched to maize. That was the most important domestic product. Maine, the main product was boards made of trees. So that was the official money. Barbados and other Caribbean colonies, which were part of the same first English empire, sugar. So that was their currency. Long Island, their main product was whale bones from dead whales that were cast on shore. So they kind of processed the bones and sent it to Europe to make combs and other small instruments. So all these colonies, they had this problem of chronic shortage of coin. So they improvised with the products that they produced themselves or bought from the Native Americans. That was the colonial standard. And Massachusetts initially, as a northern colony, it started with the beaver pelts. You see it in the law books immediately. They adopted it as official money, but very quickly they switched to maize as one of the more important official currencies. Now, there were two exceptions that were objects that did not have intrinsic value. The first was in Bermuda. And Bermuda, as some of you know, already had coins in 1615. These were token coins. They had very little intrinsic value. They were made of bronze, and they were produced probably in England and sent to this corporate colony to circulate. And they were not convertible into gold upon demand. There was no gold in Bermuda, but the general store of the corporation, the Company of Bermuda, the governor paid wages in that coin. The general store of the corporation accepted this coin for all the goods that it sold. So it could function based not on gold, but on a promise of the government of that area, which is not the same thing as legal tender for taxes. But again, it says the government determines what's coin and the government backs it in some way. But it did not last long. Another example was the wampum of the Indians. So for the Indians, that was currency with intrinsic value. It was their jewelry. And in many, many, many societies around the world, seashells or seashell beads doubled as money and jewelry. And it was the same for the Native Americans of New England. But when Massachusetts, and later Plymouth and New Netherlands adopted wampum as official money, they did not see it as something of intrinsic value. To them, it was as intrinsically useless as a piece of paper or as a bronze coin. But they did agree to accept it in exchange voluntarily and later for taxes, because they knew they could convert it, not legally, but on the market, they could convert it into beaver pelts held by the Native Americans. So these were two exceptions that could have led the way, in some sense, to the paper money of 1690. Could have. It's a bit speculative. Now, Massachusetts kind of started with that. The records of other colonies are a bit only partially survived from the 1630s. So I'm not sure that Massachusetts was the first to adopt wampum, but otherwise Massachusetts was definitely the most creative one. So 1 year after colonization, 1631, it already passes a law that any private bill can be assigned as an IOU to anyone else. So it was assignable like a check. So any IOU that anybody gave to someone for goods could be assigned, and whoever issued the IOU would be required by law to redeem it at some point. That's 1 year after colonization. That's something that was not allowed legally in England until the 18th century. Then they allowed, they were the first colony in Massachusetts to make bullion official currency after they started hosting pirates and privateers from the Caribbean. Massachusetts was the first to legalize Dutch and Spanish coin. It used even cattle at some point for coins, for at least for large transactions. And one of the most curious things was the use of bullets. So there is this law from 1635 that says bullets are official money. I don't know of any other society that used bullets. Why did they do it? Well, they didn't have coins, they didn't have small change. They needed something for small change. That was 2 years before they adopted wampum. Now, Massachusetts was an armed society. As you can see in this painting, every man had a gun. Every man had at least dozens of bullets at home. Bullets back then were literally small balls made of lead. And you can see here a mold to prepare these balls from very soft lead. Everybody had those. And they said, well, everybody has them. Everybody knows how a proper bullet lead looks like. You would not accept in a transaction something that was improper lead bullet because, well, maybe your life depends on it. So let's make it into currency. You don't even need to make a stamp on it like you would with a coin because everybody knows how a lead bullet looks like and how it feels and how it weighs. So they turned lead bullets into actually coins without having to stamp them. That's brilliant. No other society did it. But after this law from 1635, we never hear of bullets again. So it seems like wampum replaced it. So Massachusetts, in its very first decade, already went far ahead of any other colony, and I will explain later why. Massachusetts was also the only colony to operate its own mint. So Bermuda had its coin shipped from the corporation in England. Maryland also had coins shipped probably from England. Massachusetts definitely had its own mint. It started during the interregnum when there was no king in England. The king was beheaded and it simply opened its own mint. And as some of you know, thousands of private businesses in England did the same. Once the king was dead and the royal monopoly on coinage was gone, thousands of businesses, very small businesses like alehouses, issued their own small coins, very, very small coins like pence and halfpence and farthings. And Massachusetts kind of did the same, with a bit higher denominations, and they kept doing it until the king actually forced them to shut down the mint. It took him a long time. It happened probably in 1682. So that's another thing that makes Massachusetts unique. These were not token coins. These were proper silver coins. So with these coins, we reached the 1680s. And in the 1680s, we have the first paper money in North America, and it was not Massachusetts. Paper money, just looking at the material, there was another colony that did it first, and that's Canada. Canada improvised paper money from cards, playing cards, in 1685. And the reason was kind of standard. There was a military emergency. They needed to pay soldiers in some way. They didn't have coins. Coins were supposed to be shipped from France and they were late. So the governor improvised on the back of playing cards, turned it into paper money. Now, I called it old new paper money. Why is that? It's because although it's the first paper money in North America, its legal support was actually kind of in the old, like in the old world. I see someone saying here that you don't see the presentation. Is that true? Can someone tell me if it's true or not? Whether it's someone's problem or... Can you see the presentation? Someone wrote me that...
I am seeing the presentation here. Can any of our other users confirm?
Okay.
Yeah, Jeff says he sees it. So for the user who's not seeing the images, you might want to get out of Zoom and restart. So please continue, Dror.
All right, thank you. So legally speaking, this paper money was not new. It was new to North America, but there were various precedents in the old world. So this paper money was, first of all, it was forced under penalty on all sellers, and it was promised that it would be redeemed for proper silver coin once that would arrive from France, and it was redeemed. So this is similar to paper monies from the old world. So you have here paper money from China under the Mongol occupation, which, as I told you, Marco Polo tells about it, that everybody had to accept it under penalty. A similar currency that was also forced under penalty and was redeemed after the military emergency. These were sort of paper coins issued in the city of Leiden in the United Provinces or the Netherlands in 1574. These coins, paper coins, were issued while the Spanish besieged the city. So the military governor simply issued these paper coins to pay his soldiers so that they could buy the food they needed. And after the emergency, it was redeemed for coin. So this paper money of Canada, it was new to North America, but it was not really new. It was just copying from the old world. So in 1690, Massachusetts actually was in a war with Canada, the same Canada that issued paper money from playing cards. There was a war. It was called it was called over there in America, it was called the 9 Years' War. It was part of an Anglo-French war. And it was the first time that the English and French colonies fought each other in North America. And in 1690, after a serious attacks by Canada on the northern colonies, the northern colonies decided to attack Canada. And they were very ambitious. One expedition went through land from Albany and tried to occupy Montreal. It was an expedition of New York and Connecticut, and it failed. The expedition actually never made it to Montreal. It went back. The most interesting thing here is that Massachusetts and Plymouth, which was a different colony, they sailed all the way to Quebec and back. They tried to occupy Quebec City. They failed. It was a very brief battle, and they returned. They sailed in August, they returned in November because the St. Lawrence River began to freeze. Now, it's important that it was 3 months. That's critical because they had to pay all the soldiers, and we're talking about more than 2,000 soldiers out of a population of 50,000. That's a lot. 4% of the population, that's a lot for the early modern period. They had to pay all these men wages for 3 months. That was a lot of money, and they didn't have it. They actually counted on plundering Quebec City and used that to pay the wages. For all the soldiers, they did not have any plan B. What would happen if they failed to occupy Quebec City? So what did they do? Well, they were actually very prudent. They raised the taxes 20 times the normal annual amount. But then there was this problem of liquidity, because it would take a lot of time for taxpayers to come up with taxes 20 times the normal amount. And in the meanwhile, what would the soldiers do? How would they buy food for families that barely managed to provide for themselves for 3 months? And it's already November, and it went through December and very cold winter. So soldiers had a problem. They were mutinous, we are told by the historian of the episode. So what they did, they had this method of stating the debt to every soldier. Every soldier received a financial instrument that was called debenture. And that's how it looked like. Debenture was simply kind of like the treasury's IOU. And here it says in some Old English, there is due unto John Corsair for serving their majesties against the French and Indian enemy as a cook under the commander of someone. So he was a cook on a ship, the sum of £9, 1 shilling, 6 pence. Now, £9, that was a lot of money. That was a wage for 3 months. And here this soldier, John Corsair, received this single piece of paper that had this very, very large amount, not even a round amount, but £9, 1 shilling and 6 pence. And okay, what do you do with it? You can't go shopping and in one shop buy 3 months worth of food or supplies. It's crazy. You can't do that. So they said, well, let's say you're a soldier, you come home from war, you get this debenture, and then you also get a tax bill. The constable comes and he says, well, pay me £9. Well, I don't have £9. I don't even have food to eat. How am I going to pay £9? So the first step was making these debentures legal tender for taxes. So they said, you hold a debenture, pay your taxes with it. Have a set-off with the constable. At least get rid of your tax liability. And that was the first time they did it with the debentures. Debentures were kind of common practice during wars. And that's the first time they made them into legal tender for taxes, probably because many soldiers face this impossible situation of not being paid with money that you can actually buy with and having this tax bill to pay. They may have even thought the following. If I sell goods and I have this big tax bill to pay, and the soldier comes with a debenture and buys a 3 months worth of maize, maybe I can accept this huge debenture, hugely denominated debenture, because then I can pay my taxes with it, maybe. Turns out it didn't work. Soldiers were still quite angry and upset that they couldn't buy food. So here is the crucial step. They took the debenture of £9, 1 shilling and 6 pence, and 2,000 other debentures like it, and they split it into small denomination, standardized bills. And that's the bill that I showed you at the beginning. So it looks like an IOU, and it says this indented bill of 5 shillings, just 5 shillings. You could buy maize for your family, for an average family, for 1 week. I did the calculation. That's a reasonable amount of money to spend. 5 shillings, as opposed to the debenture of £9, you could actually break the debenture into 36 bills of 5 shillings, because 20 shillings were £1. And just like the debenture, it says it could be accepted by the treasurer and receivers subordinates to him in all public payments. So it's legal tender for taxes. The treasurer would accept it. Nobody else has to accept it. Only the treasurer makes a commitment. There's no commitment to convert it into gold coin or anything else. It all relies on the treasurer receiving it in public payments. Today, we call it legal tender for taxes. And I say that this is like minting the debenture. And this is a critical point. Because what do you do in minting? You take this lump of silver, back then silver was the main monetary metal, and you physically break it down into small pieces of equal size, equal denomination, you put some stamp on them, and it's small enough so that you can actually go shopping with it. It's small denomination, it's standardized denomination. Note that unlike the debenture, it doesn't have a name on it. You don't need to assign it on the back like you would with a check today. And as you would with a named debenture. It doesn't have any name on it. It's like a payable to the bearer. Whoever holds it has the whatever legal status it promises. So it's like taking this huge debenture of a very large non-round amount, and breaking it down into smaller pieces, anonymous, standardized, stamped, that you can actually use in shopping. That's why I'm making this very bold statement that this invention was essentially minting the debentures themselves. So that's the monetary revolution. It's paper money that does not rely on gold, does not rely on anyone redeeming it, neither the government nor the sellers in the market. The sellers were not forced to accept it. Unlike China, unlike Canada 5 years earlier, sellers were not forced to accept it. So that's the brilliant invention. Now I will try to explain why and how it happened in 1690 Massachusetts. Why? So, as I said, necessity is the mother of invention. And 1690 was a very, very peculiar time in constitutional history. I already told you about the war, but in terms of the Constitution, it was a very, very tricky time. In 1682, as I told you, England forced Massachusetts to close the mint. The fact that Massachusetts issued its own coin and even made it legal tender for private transactions and taxes, it was considered high treason in England. And that was one of the top excuses for England to revoke the Massachusetts corporate charter in 1684. Then they imposed some dictatorship on New England. It was called the Dominion of New England in 1686. 1689, New England learns about the Glorious Revolution in England. All the New England colonies revolt, dismantle this foreign dominion, and resurrect their own old governments. So in 1690, Massachusetts had its old general court, it was called, that ruled the colony from 1630 until 1684. And Massachusetts agents in England, led by Harvard president Increase Mather, they lobbied the king to reinstate the old charter or give them a new charter. That was 1690. And Increase Mather tried to do it. And the king, he was actually a Dutch man, William III, he came in the Glorious Revolution. He asked his legal advisor, he asked the Attorney General and the Solicitor General, okay, these Puritans like me, he was a Calvinist, they want their charter back, should we give them? And they say, no, this is a crazy colony. They actually issued their own coins. And we just took away their charter because of that. So, based on a lot of circumstantial evidence, I think I prove in the book that in that particular point in time, 1690, Massachusetts was afraid of issuing proper money. The mint was still there, it was closed. We know that they asked the king, if you give us a charter, please allow us to mint our own coins. The mint was there, but shut down for 8 years. Now, technically, they had printing presses, at least one in Cambridge for Harvard College and one in Boston, commercial printing press. They could have printed paper money, no doubt about that. But unlike Canada, unlike China, if they had forced this paper money on everyone, it would have looked like they're making money again. And they couldn't take this chance of alienating England once again, while Harvard's president is lobbying the king to get their old charter back. So I think it's all about the colony's charter. In 1691, they got a new charter. But in 1690, they were still begging for the old charter. And again, in the book, a lot of circumstantial evidence that they were very, very careful. And I think it's also the reason why they didn't call it money. It says bill. It doesn't say money, it doesn't say paper money, it doesn't say currency, it says bill. That's like an IOU. It's not money. Okay? So there is this possibility, plausible denial that this is not money, we are just issuing IOUs. Even the soldiers were not forced to accept this paper money as payment. Soldiers could swap their debentures for this paper money. They didn't have to. And the sellers in the markets were not under any obligation to accept it. Only the treasurer had to accept it. So it's like the treasury's IOU. It's not money, just an IOU. So that's about the very peculiar necessity in that point of time. Not just war, but also a very sensitive constitutional moment. Now, this circumstance of having to pay soldiers, that was very common in the early modern period. Dozens of examples, including in England, that the government didn't have money to pay for war. The military revolution that started a century earlier made wars very, very expensive. That's what eventually led governments to become tax-based rather than based on the king's private domain. They were based on tax collection. So many governments had this problem, and the typical result was that the soldiers mutinied, defected, deserted, plundered the towns of their employers. So how was Massachusetts able to come up with an invention that other governments could not? It was a very small colony, 50,000 people on the edge of Western civilization. London was much more sophisticated financially. Amsterdam was the financial capital of Western Europe. So why Massachusetts? How Massachusetts? How were they able to come up with this invention? So Massachusetts was a colony. It was nothing like London in terms of sophistication. It was nothing like, it didn't have Cambridge and Oxford. But in the colonial scene, it was very unusual. The typical colonists who settled in America in the 17th century were poor people looking for a job, to stay alive, to not be hungry. Many of them were former pirates, privateers, soldiers. They came for economic opportunity. Only the Puritans were just an average sample of the English population, not just the poor. Many of them were middle class. And that was important because Massachusetts was not a typical colony because of that. Now, I won't say that most of them were middle class, but enough of them were middle class. In other colonies, you can find some college graduate here and there. You can find, obviously they had a minister in every town, in every large town at least. That's about it. In Massachusetts, from the beginning, all the way to 1690, you had dozens of these people at every point in time. So as I say here, Massachusetts was English America's leader in two aspects. They had dozens of scholars, and Harvard was actually where these people were educated. It was the only college in English America all the way to 1690. And it was also the commercial center of English America. Before there was New York City, before Philadelphia became a mercantile hub, Boston was the first mercantile hub. It specialized in trade, in intercontinental trade. Trade of many colonies was centered in Boston. Especially they sent products of New England to the Caribbean sugar colonies, exchange it for sugar, sail to England, and dispose the sugar there for manufacturers, which they then imported back to New England. That was the biggest trade triangle, as it was called. But either way, Massachusetts was the only place that was a leader, both intellectually and in terms of commerce. And I think this was important not only for the monetary invention of 1690, but also for the inventions of these 6 decades that actually turned Massachusetts, and Massachusetts alone in the colonial scene, into a laboratory of monetary experiment. And we've seen this very unique tradition of monetary experiments, and I don't have time to tell you about experiments of banks in the 1680s. I just don't have the time. I elaborated about that in the book. And just to give you examples, why is it important to have intellectuals and merchants? So here is one guy from Harvard. His name is Cotton Mather. He was the son of Harvard's president, and he's the historian of this episode. And he's actually the prophet of modern currency. He said in 1697, when he wrote the history of this episode, that this is an example for any people in other parts of the world who need a sudden supply of money for any important expedition. He knew that this was a big thing. No one has done it before, and perhaps everyone will imitate us. And he was right. It took 3 centuries, but he was right eventually. Now, he was not an outsider. He was probably consulted by the general court. There is some circumstantial evidence for that. He actually, because the population was skeptical about the paper money, he actually published a pamphlet to convince the public that this was a good form of money and they should accept it. So he tried to promote the paper money in public right after it was issued for the first time. It's important to know that at Harvard, scholars learned about statements from the greatest minds of Western civilization that could have led them to the conclusion that currency could be based on tax payments. So Aristotle and Plato said that money didn't have to have intrinsic value. And most importantly, the contemporary Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan, he said that the treasury was the heart of the monetary system, not the mint. Not the mint that receives a worn coin and bullion and creates new coins, but the treasury, because it receives a coin in tax payments and emits it again to the public when the government spends the coins. Based on these statements, Harvard scholars could have found a path to paper money which was legal tender for taxes and not related to gold. That's about Harvard. Now, for the merchants, I have an entire chapter as a biography of the merchant who he was listed at the head of the committee that issued the paper money. His name was Elisha Hutchinson. He belongs to a family of Hutchinsons, which is very famous in New England history. It was Anne Hutchinson and Thomas Hutchinson, in case you know them. He's among this family. Now, Massachusetts, it's not just that the merchants were important economically. It was a merchant republic, like Amsterdam, like Venice, where the merchants did everything other than being pastors in the churches. They did everything. They dominated the government. They were the military officers. They were the tax collectors or tax commissioners. They are the ones who gave orders to the constables to collect the taxes. And there were obviously the main sellers in the economy. There were the retailers. Some of them were also doing wholesales. So they did all these things. They did everything in the government. They did everything in the colony except for the churches. That's the only thing that the ministers did. Why is that important? Because the problem of the colony, in this diagram you see it, there was a very large debt of taxpayers to the government. As I said, they increased the taxes. The government itself was just an intermediary. It owed money to the soldiers. It needed the tax proceeds in silver coin or maize from the taxpayers before it could pay the soldiers. Now, all these taxpayers, they were supposed to obtain funds to pay taxes by selling stuff. Let's say sell food in the marketplace. So they were not just taxpayers, they were also sellers. That was the problem. Now, since the merchants were not just merchants, they did not specialize in mercantile careers, they could solve this problem very easily. The government issued a bill. You see here, that's the first step. They gave it to the soldiers. The soldiers went to the shops, exchanged the bill for food voluntarily. It was a voluntary transaction. The sellers received the bills because as taxpayers, they could pay the bills to the government. So there you have it, this circulation of currency from the government to the soldiers, to the sellers who are then taxpayers, return the money to the government. You don't need silver coins for that. You don't need gold bullion. You can do it with a cow. You can do it with bread. You can do it with paper money. And that's the easiest thing to do. So they did it with paper money. And because it was a merchant republic and the merchants did all these things at the same time, they filled all these positions, that's why they could do it. That's why they could come up with a solution. So as I show in this chapter about Elisha Hutchinson, he was the commander of Boston's militia. He was a legislator. He was a member of the executive, the government. He was the tax commissioner of Boston. He was a merchant. He was one of the biggest sellers. So he was all of these things. He could understand the perspective, the point of view, the interests of all these three characters in this story. And I think that's why he and his colleagues, his peers, could solve this problem in a way that no other government previously could. So to summarize this part, I'll go back a bit. So the paper money was actually just minting a debenture that was legal tender for taxes. They had this foundation in the debenture that was named, had a non-round large denomination, and they did a small, brilliant step to turn it into currency. They needed to do it because it was a very sensitive constitutional moment. It was an English colony and they wanted their charter back, so they couldn't issue proper money and just forcing it on everyone like Canada did. And how were they able to devise this new money? Because they were the intellectual center and the mercantile center. So these are my conclusions of the story. Now, because this is a numismatic symposium, I think you would be interested to know about other bills that have survived or that we know of. So it's not exactly a census. It's a bit more and a bit less, as you will see. Now, I try to locate every evidence of these bills because for my research, I wanted to see the signatures. So my distant past as an amateur teenager money collector taught me that every detail on a coin and currency matters. So I saw the listing of 3 names on each bill, and these were committee members. So there was a committee of 5 men, 5 merchants, obviously, because they were the financial experts. Each bill had 3 signatures, and various bills had different signatures, a different sample of 3 men out of 5. And it was important. I wanted to understand whether the order of the signatures was important. So I tried to locate every evidence of these bills from anywhere, even bills that we don't know where they are today, that did not actually survive. So I have to apologize. I cannot remember where I got all these pictures that I took. I don't have copyright for any of them except for this one I got from the Peabody Essex Museum. I don't have copyright for anything else. If it's a problem, you can cut it out of the recording when you post it. But here's what I know. So I know of 3 bills. I know at least the text of 3 bills that were issued in the very first issue of December 1690. Here you have the one in Peabody Essex Museum. In 1691, some people sent this to London, this very nice copy. And it looks totally authentic. I mean, nothing about it raises any suspicion. It was actually in a pamphlet that was that attempted to frame Massachusetts. And the pamphlet said, look at them, they're issuing money again. They're issuing paper money. And this was part of the pamphlet. And I have no idea what this particular bill is now. Maybe it never survived beyond 1691. In the 19th century, there is a book that reproduces this bill, number 4980, and I have no idea where it is now. So this is the evidence I have of 3 bills, 3 specific bills from December 1690. Now you need to be careful because there are more bills, a larger number of bills that say February 1690. Now, you should pay attention that back then, the year changed on March 25th. So when the records say, and when the paper money itself say February the 3rd, as you can see on each one of these bills, we would call it February 3rd, 1691. So that's 2 months later, after the bills I showed you before. And at least one historian from the 19th century who was not careful, and he said in great confidence, these bills have nothing to do with the expedition to Quebec that took place in the fall of 1690. And here's the proof. We have bills from February 1690. So he was wrong, and I urge you not to be wrong in the same way. So there are a bit more bills from what is actually February 1691. Massachusetts was extremely careful. They did not just print paper money and said, well, let's hope there's no inflation. They raised the taxes in the proper amount to pay the debt to the soldiers. The paper money was there just to solve the problem of liquidity, of allowing the soldiers to use some money to go shopping with, and for the sellers to pay the currency to the government, these taxes. The currency was there not to inflate the debt away, as we would say, call it. It was not there to create inflation. It was there just to solve a temporary liquidity problem. And part of the prudence of Massachusetts was to issue, at first in December, paper money for the total amount of 7,000 pounds. And when they realized it worked okay, in February, they issued a larger amount, 33,000 pounds. The whole debt to the soldiers was 40,000. So they started with 7 and they issued almost 5 times that amount in February 1691. So I know this is private. I have it in my notes that this is in the hands of some private collector. And I think, I'm not entirely sure, this is held at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and this one is at the Smithsonian. And other bills that I have no idea what they are today, and they all say February 1690. I can give you the numbers if you can't see it well online. And the last one I will show you, it's not the bill itself, it's a description, again from a book from the 19th century, and I have no idea where it is today. So this is a description of a bill with a different serial number, 916. And this is interesting because if you've never seen any of these bills, so here it says in the description, struck from an engraved plate, copper plate, I know that from the records, pieces of paper nearly square, 5 3/4 of an inch from top to bottom, and about 5 inches wide. And where this bill is now, I have no idea. So this is not exactly a census, but that's the best that I could come up with. Evidence of all the bills that whose content was specifically recorded in history. So that's something numismatic for them. And I think I'm out of time.
Hey, all right, Dror, thank you very much for presenting. I'm going to open it for Q&A. You can just enter that into the chat, and we do have a few already. So first question, how do the Massachusetts indented bill compare to a bill of exchange?
Great question. So bill of exchange is like the debenture. It was for a very large amount. This was for merchants. It was like, think of a paper instrument today of tens of thousands of dollars. It wasn't money. It was a financial instrument, but it was, the denomination was just huge. It wasn't money. So it's very similar, and actually it's a very good question, because the merchants' main experience with financial instruments was with bills of exchange. That's how they did most of their trade. They also dealt with IOUs of individuals. They had book debts when they handled for the transactions with the farmers in Massachusetts. They ran all these issuing of debentures whenever there was a war. But yes, most of the time for their job as merchants, they handled bills of exchange. Many times they did a set-off between bills, or they assigned them. And actually, as Cotton Mather tells us in 1690, this whole thing is a set-off operation. A seller holds a bill that was given to a soldier. He holds that because he sold food to the soldier. He holds that, and then the constable comes and asks for a tax payment. So it's a set-off, because you pay the tax with the government's own IOU. So the merchants were completely fluent in bills of exchange and set-offs and other types of financial transactions. And that was probably critical for the invention of paper money, that, unlike the bill of exchange, had very, very small denomination. So it was actually currency. It's a very good question.
Next question, does the Peabody Essex Museum have an original bill, or is that a copy?
It's the original.
Okay.
And they gave me the permission to show it when I promote the book.
Okay. All right, so any other questions, just type them in the chat. We do have the book here. Book is called Easy Money, American Puritans and the Invention of Modern Currency, available on Amazon, or I'm sure many online booksellers have it. So another comment, fantastic presentation, learned a lot. Thank you. Stay safe in Israel.
Thank you.
I think we can all resonate with that sentiment. Right. Any other questions? Feel free to enter them into the chat. We have another one. Do we know who printed the bills?
No, not exactly. So, as I said, there were at least 2 printing presses at the time. One at Harvard. They had one since the beginning, since the 1630s. They had to have a printing press. There was another one, a commercial press in Boston. That one was there at least from the late 1670s. At some point, after the owner died, it was operated by the most famous diarist of the period, Samuel Sewall. He wrote a famous diary. He was a judge at the Salem witch trials. He actually managed the press for just a few years until someone else took over. And he was actually one of the legislators in 1690 that Elisha Hutchinson, who led the paper money committee, was one of his best friends. So actually we had a former printing press manager in the legislature and the executive in 1690. Who was the manager at that time, we don't know. There could have been another press in Boston in 1690. There was a press, perhaps the same one, operated by someone called Samuel Green. He actually printed 2 months earlier, he printed the first newspaper in American history. And the general court was furious that someone printed a newspaper during a war without license. So they actually shut it down. And the next newspaper was printed only in the 18th century. The only other printing press in North America was in Philadelphia, which was a very, very young town. Also for religious purposes, they were very serious, the Quakers, about education. So they also had the printing press from the beginning. So as far as I know, there were at least 3 in North America. No more colleges, no additional colleges at that point. The College of William and Mary is just a few years later.
All right. I think that may be it for the questions. Anything else, just pop it in now. We do have one more. Did they have any trouble with contemporary counterfeiting?
Absolutely. So I read some argument that one of the bills that I showed you is actually counterfeited. That the original denomination was 2 shillings, and someone added a 0 and turned it into 20 shillings. So yeah, obviously. Yes, there is so that's the only evidence I know of contemporary counterfeiting. And we also have evidence from the early 18th century, before all the other colonies imitated Massachusetts. By the way, all the New England colonies, the other New England colonies in New York and New Jersey, in the next war with Canada, they also issued paper money using exactly the same text with only the necessary modifications. They used the exact same text for many, many years. So I have some evidence from the early 18th century that someone was actually convicted of counterfeiting the money. As I said, regarding 1690, 1691, there is the argument that someone said, well, I think there is counterfeiting on this bill. It should have been 2 shillings and someone turned it into 20. Yeah, obviously, people are people,
Yep.
They would counterfeit anything.
Yeah, and obviously the counterfeiting got a lot more prevalent with the increased circulation of that colonial paper money. Okay, all right, I think that'll wrap it up on the questions. So Dror, thank you very much. And for everyone else, we will have additional sessions through Saturday. So look forward to seeing you for the other presentations. All right, thank you very much, Dror.
Thank you. Bye-bye.